Greetings, everyone. I am Oblyron, Lord of the Underworld and consort to the most lovely Hecate. Thank you for joining me on today's episode, where we are going to talk about how spiritual dogma can be a trap to our spiritual growth. And if you resonate with today's message, please feel free to let us all know by leaving a like, comment, or a subscribe. So one thing that I think is very interesting is that we all get into spiritualism and we all dive into the ethers of our practices to basically free our minds and to free our spirits and to free our souls. And somewhere along the line, we get wrapped up in so much of our own beliefs that we're not really free anymore. And I noticed this happening, well, it kind of manifests in various points throughout our lives. Many of us, when we are children, were introduced to some form of spirituality or religion. And we have a tendency to dive into these practices, not really knowing what they truly mean. We just get into it because it is what our parents did, it's what our families did and whatnot. And so, we kind of go through the ropes and we basically, do as we're told. We are indoctrinated into these systems. And it really doesn't matter which religion we belong to. Some of us go into Christianity, some of us go into Buddhism, some of us go into Catholicism, Hinduism, many isms and ologies, and all of these things that we are slowly indoctrinated into. And it seems like by probably around maybe our adolescence, or perhaps even a little bit later for some of us, we have a tendency to reject these teachings. And we have a tendency to sort of, for many of us, we have a tendency to walk away from spiritualism for a while until we kind of rediscover it on our own terms later on in life. And there's nothing really wrong with that. It's just a natural process of life. As we grow and as we age, we do have a tendency to want to establish our own individuality from that which we were raised. We have a tendency to want to discover who we are, independent of who we are told that we are. And so many times, I think, even as a society, we've had a tendency to do this. During the 20th century, many people in the Western world had a habit of adopting Eastern traditions. That was when rock stars had a tendency to go and travel to India to seek these Indian gurus and to basically adopt these forms of spiritual practices which were so far removed from anything that they had experienced. And, ironically, for many of those people who grew up in those areas, they also had a tendency to adopt, let's say, Christianity. They had a tendency to adopt Western religions, not with the greatest, or not in the same proportions that the West adopted the East, but, it did happen. We see this in Japan, we see this in Korea, where, many Christian and Jesuit missionaries were very successful in converting the local population. I think it's kind of natural to want to be exploratory. It's kind of natural to want to adopt something which is so foreign and alien to you. I think maybe even in our own recent history too, especially with the New Age movement, we've had a tendency to adopt, many of these spiritual and philosophical doctrines which were so far removed from, let's say, many of the religious practices that it seems almost kind of welcoming in a sense. But many times, what we have to realize is that these practices, the more you start to be around them and the more you start to learn different practices and different religions and different ways of meditating and all these things, they're really all a similar path. And I think, especially with the New Age practices and with the whole love and light philosophies that we've been seeing, that they've been in the mainstream long enough that we're kind of seeing a bit of the drawbacks behind it too, a bit of how even these spiritual practices, which we initially adopted to liberate us, how they can also trap us as well. And so, that's really the trapping of a lot of these practices. It doesn't matter where you go, there you are. And what I've found, even in my own practice, is that we may want to adopt something which is foreign to us, but even in those systems and even in those new ways of thinking, there are still limitations. I mean, everything that we see was written by someone. Everything came from someone's mind. And if it came from someone's mind, we as humans, we're not infallible. None of us are God. None of us have all the answers. You could spend a whole lifetime of learning various spiritual practices, and even if let's say you're from the US and you decided to really dive into Hinduism, you're never going to know what it's like to experience that religion if you didn't grow up in India, because so much of that practice is tied into local cultures, local folkways, mores, and taboos. And you'll always be an outsider to that. So to go to some ashram and to consult some guru, you can get a taste of what it's like, and you can get many revelations and experience these wonderful visions. But at the same time, that there still is a certain limitation because of being an outsider going to a foreign culture. And let's say that we get rid of all of the cultural implications behind that. Let's say that there are no barriers to learning, and we can actually truly experience these spiritual practices for what they are. Well, guess what? At some point, even your own beliefs, even your own constructs and everything that you study, at some point, even that becomes dogma. And the moment things become dogma, the moment things become belief systems to which we begin to go on autopilot, that's the moment we stop growing. That's the moment that we stop truly becoming aware of who and what we are. And that's when we start to kind of go on autopilot a little bit. I compare a lot of my own spiritual practices to music. I don't know if it's because I've been a musician so long and I see everything as music, but I have found many similarities between spirituality and music. As a musician, we can practice these chords, these scales, we can learn all these tunes, we can learn all this stuff and fill our heads with so much knowledge and so much information. But really what connects us to the audience is is how that music just makes people feel. It's really about working in that real time, and it's really about being present. And it's not to say that those rules and that music theory, or let's say those spiritual practices, it's not to say that it's not important. They're very important. But also at the same time, when it becomes a definition of who and what our belief system is, that's also when we begin to stagnate. I always say, you need to learn the rules to forget the rules. And that's also a thing that a lot of musicians teach as well. You practice all these things to where it becomes muscle memory, and you basically are connected to your instrument through pure sound. Well, spirituality is the same way. We learn, let's say, these sayings, or we learn these chakras, and we learn these meditations and these mantras and all of it. And at some point, it's really just about letting it all go so that we can come back to the present moment. And so that's really the trapping of dogma. That's really the trapping of our spiritual beliefs. And I see it in a lot of people. I see it, sometimes in comments. Maybe not necessarily on this channel, but, as I watch other spiritual channels, I see people that they're so busy arguing, their particular perspective. And it's like, well, are you really even listening or hearing or operating in real time anymore? When people draw that line in the sand and they start to defend that line in the sand, we lose a lot of the ability to be able to operate in real time. I mean, even also again in my own spiritual practice, I've kind of gotten to this point to where it's like, as I've said in my last video, in the quickening of light and shadow, you get to a point to where you're experiencing things where you haven't really necessarily read about it or have heard about it. And even though I've gotten to this point and I've kind of had this synthesis of let's say these spiritual beings coming into my life, and excuse me for a moment, had a synthesis of these spiritual beings coming into my life, was revealed these truths, and had so many things which I began to connect with on such different levels. Even at some point with everything, I have to be able to let it all go. Everything that I've experienced, I know with, let's say, 99% accuracy that there is truth to it, that there was an experience. My spiritual experiences have completely changed my life. And again, like I said, even though there is this 99.99% belief or knowing in it, there is still that 0.01% where, maybe it's just all in my mind. Maybe when we move on from this plane of existence, we really just become food for the bacteria and the maggots. And as long as that 0.01% is there, I think it's always important to have a little bit of that uncertainty, and to have a little bit of that humility and that humbleness, so that we don't become too inflated in our own egos. And again, like I said, I'm some guy who has these vast underworld connections, and who had a goddess come into my life and all this, but at the same time, maybe it's just all in my head. And And as long as that mentality is there, as long as that attitude is there, it helps me to keep my eyes open, and it helps me to really observe other people in real time. I've seen other people who say things like, well, it's just about knowing, and it's just about having 100% faith and all this kind of stuff. And yeah, I agree. I agree. But again, there's always that small percentage that maybe it is just all in our heads. And I don't think it's necessarily a limiting thing. I think it's actually a very liberating type of way to approach things, because you can never be too sure of yourself. And as long as you're never too sure of yourself, you're always growing and learning. You're always looking at life with an open mind. And your spiritual beliefs and your spiritual practices are not so etched in stone. You don't become so weighed down by your own dogma. You don't become so weighed down by your own belief system. So, if you've resonated with today's message, then again, feel free to leave a like, subscribe, or a comment. I would love to hear from you all. And yes, thank you for staying till the end. I really appreciate it. And now, and if you're interested in group meditations, I hold them every Saturday on my Discord. I also have other articles and writings which I post on my Discord that I don't always necessarily post on my videos. So yeah, feel free to stop on by. It's a growing community. All right, well, thank you again. Love and light and wisdom in shadow. And so if you're So if you've resonated with today's message, then feel free to leave a like, subscribe, or a comment and let us know how you've resonated with today's message. I also hold weekly group meditations on my Discord server. I also post things on that server that I don't necessarily talk about in these videos. And I also host a variety of services on that Discord server as well. So check it out. The link is in the description. And again, I thank you all for staying till the end, and love and light and wisdom in shadow. And now we shall close with the chant of Oblyron. Amde sote, Amde-Oblyron, Amde sote, Amde-Oblyron.